Okay, so the webinar will show you how to use Wolfram Chat Notebooks technology to create chat environments for any purpose. So when we're talking about persona, we're talking about things that allow you to configure the personality, the goals, the special skills, and safety guardrails for your chatbot. We'll start with the basics of prompt engineering, but we'll quickly move on to things like computational tools because that's really where the power of the persona comes into play. So we'll focus on on computational tools mainly, and we'll look at some functionality about deploying APIs or deploying your personas as APIs that other people can access and so on. So just a few words on the sorry, just some people are saying that the notebook access link is invalid, so let me just flag that to our team so they can fix that. Apologies for that. Um, Sending a message to our team. Um, this will be fixed in a minute. Apologies for that. If anyone is trying to download that. Um, while that is being fixed, I'll let you know when that is fixed when I hear back from our team. While that is being fixed, I'll just go through the basic setup. Um, so obviously we will be using LLMs for the majority, well, not the majority, the entirety of this webinar. And the only thing that you need to have available is an LLM backend. Now that can come from several places. You could use an external provider. Um, you could use OpenAI, you can use Anthropic. We support most of the major providers out of the box. So the way you connect to any of them is you register for their service, you obtain an API key, and you just link it from your Mathematica, and you're able to use their API immediately. It's meant to be the connections are meant to be very straightforward. So here you can see I have an OpenAI API key, so I can choose from any of the OpenAI models. And once I select the model, all of the LLM functionality in Wolfram Mathematica becomes available to me. So that's one way you can use. That's one way you can get a LLM backend. Another way is through Wolfram itself. So we have mm, we have Wolfram LLM Toolkit, which is a subscription-based service that you can get directly from us, in which you get an LLM backend provided by Wolfram, and you're able to use all of the LLM functionality in Wolfram Mathematica, and you also get access to a Notebook Assistant, which is our kind of our version of Copilot. So it's LLM chatbot that is meant to help you write code. Uh, just in general help you get through your workflows in your notebooks. So you get that only with LLM Toolkit. If you use external providers, you don't get that. And finally, as of recently, we have support for local LLM models through Olama. So there are quite a few different providers for local models, or I should say, different software that you can use to link um, to local models. The one we are supporting out of the box currently is Olama, which is one of the most popular ones. So to use that, you only need to download Olama. It's a free software, free and open source, as far as I'm aware. Um, and yeah, if you have that, again, you can link to it in the same way that you do with the other external services. One thing to mention about the local LLMs is that they will be you will need quite a powerful PC to run them, and you can choose different size of models. So if you have a not so powerful PC, you can run some of the smaller models, um, although they are very much limited in what they can do. But yeah, if you are using local models, the important thing to say is that you are kind of responsible for the back end of things, that you are able to run the model and that it's functioning properly and that it's suitable for the tasks that you are trying to use it for. Cool. So we have external services. We have Wolfram LLM Toolkit, and We have local models. So whichever one you choose, just set that up. In terms of simplicity, obviously the most simple one is the Wolfram LLM Toolkit because as you already have a Wolfram account, it's just a subscription on top of that, and everything works out of the box. But choice is good. So if you do prefer external providers or if you prefer local models, that is there to be used, and it's hopefully it's as simple as possible. In this webinar, I'll be using LLM Toolkit, and I'll be using maybe I'll be using some of the OpenAI models for some of the more complicated tasks later in the webinar. But yeah, that's in terms of a setup. Um, in terms of how you actually get access to those menus, I should have mentioned there is the simplest way is on the top right of your toolbar. There is a button called Notebook Chat Settings. Um, when you click on that, you get personas, which will be the topic of our webinar today, but you also get this drop down menu called models. And that's where you choose either Wolfram or external providers or Olama. There are other ways there. You can go into the preferences menu, but they all do the same thing. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Um, before I move on, the notebook should be, the link to the notebook materials should be updated. So let me know if you can access that now. Again, apologies for the invalid link at the beginning. Okay, so let's get into it. So chat notebook. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with just normal standard Wolfram notebooks, where you're essentially mixing programming code, in this case Wolfram language code, just with narrative or just with plain text or style text, and you have this alongside your normal Wolfram language code. The idea behind chat notebooks is basically the same, uh, with the only difference that instead of having cells where you can input code, so like input cells, you have chat input cells. So let me show you what that looks like. So it's just a different type of cell, and just like in normal input cells, whatever you write gets sent to the Wolfram kernel for evaluation. In chat input cells, whatever you write gets sent to the LLM backend for evaluation. And just like you get the result from your normal input cell, you get the result from your chat input cell. This is pretty much all there is to it in terms of a theory. Um, so yeah, we'll be using, so obviously there are chat input cells are the most basic, the most kind of user friendly way to get started with LLMs. And in fact, we have our first kind of very simple example. You open a chat input cell and you type something, whatever you want to say to the LLM. You press shift and enter and you get the result back. So as I mentioned, in this case, I believe I'm using the Wolfram backend. Yep. So whatever I type into here gets sent to the LLM that's operated by Wolfram, and we get back our response. So in terms of getting started with them, um, they should be, the chat input cells are the simplest way possible. Obviously, when we start building our custom workflows, we have programmatic access to all of those, kind of more low level access to all of that functionality, and that's what we'll be going through. But in terms of getting started, um, you can just try opening a chat input cell, saying anything. Um, I see that the link is still not valid. Let me quickly double check what is up with that. I think my colleagues are still trying to sort it out. I may have announced it prematurely, so my colleagues will respond in the chat about the materials. Apologies again for that. Um, so let's keep going with the materials while this is getting sorted. So in terms of the different things you can control, there are a few kind of high level things you can control in the chat in the notebook chat settings. One of them being the personas. So with the simple example I showed you with the chat input cell, I was using a persona called plain chat, and we'll talk about what these personas are really under the hood. But for now, the important thing is that you can change them from this menu here. Um, the other important thing, obviously, is the models. Choosing your LLM backend, and there are some advanced settings if you feel like going a bit deeper into the parameters of your backend. They all live here as well. How often should the tools be called? What is the temperature, and so on. Temperature meaning how deterministic um, how deterministic the outputs of the LLM are. But you have a few a few parameters you can control right from the chat notebook settings menu. Cool. Now let's get into the personas right away. I see that the link is working now, so I'm glad to see that that's fixed. Yeah, it seems like maybe you need to restart or refresh your browser um, for that to work. Okay, so introducing persona. So what do we mean when we talk about AI persona? So broadly speaking, and at the most basic level, we when we talk about personas, we talk about a set of instructions that are aimed to define the purpose, the style, and the constraints of how the model interacts with the user. Now, the purpose, style, and constraints can be very broad, in which case we can have like very general instructions, things like always be friendly to the user, always try to help, and just general stylistic instructions like that. So the most common example of a persona with very general set of instructions are virtual assistants and chatbots. By now, we are all familiar with what those look like. Probably the most well-known example is something like ChatGPT. Even though when you open ChatGPT, you just see an empty field and you send your query, ChatGPT has instructions that are baked into it by OpenAI. And while obviously ChatGPT is not open source, so we don't know exactly what the instructions are, but we can imagine that there are things like you are a helpful, no, you're a helpful chat assistant. Try to answer the questions of the user in the best way. Try to help them with whatever they're asking. Don't engage in anything dangerous. We'll get to kind of safety prompting and safety concerns a bit later on, but these are the kinds of things that usually go into the instructions of chatbots. We can also have specific purpose personas. So those are personas that can be built with a narrower or more specific person in mind. Some examples of personas like that can be language learning tutors. So if you're designing a persona that is aimed to help somebody learn a foreign language, you might want to set its purpose to improve the user's language skills, to be patient, to be encouraging, to take its time with its explanations. And you also might want to constrain it to only talk about language learning, vocabulary building, progress tracking, things like that. So if a user tries to engage with the persona on a different topic, it can steer the conversation back to its original purpose. So all of those are basically just simple plain text instructions. Um, so there is nothing really complicated uh, uh, about guiding your persona in that way. So you just it's this term prompt engineering. You just need to find a way to phrase your instructions in a way that the LLM will follow them reliably, and that takes a bit of experimenting, that takes a bit of tweaking, but ultimately there's nothing really that complicated about it. It's just a matter of trying what works, and being more kind of refining your prompts so that in the end the persona you define ends up behaving the way you expect it to. So let's look at some actual personas. So I guess the important thing to say at this point is that when we talk about a persona, it could be as simple as that. It could be a persona that has just a very basic set of instructions, and that's it. Um, that alone is sufficient to make a persona, so to speak. It can be much more complicated, and we'll get into some complicated ones. But in terms of what is the minimum kind of standard that we would consider a persona, it could be just a few sentences of instructions. And in fact, we're going to look at a very simple persona right now. So let's look at the prompt repository. So if you're not familiar, this is one of our public repositories where users can submit their own, in this case, prompts and personas. We have several of these repositories. We have a data repository where people can curate data, they can format it in a nice Wolfram language way, and they can make it available for any user of Wolfram language um, to use it in their workflows. In this case, we're looking at the prompts. So in the personas category, we have how many? We have 59 personas that have been contributed by someone externally, and most of them are kind of what I would call stylistic personas. So they don't really do anything useful. They are stylistic in the sense that they pretend to be some character from a movie, or they talk as some historical figure and things like that. So you can explore those if you want. There's nothing super useful in terms of utilities, in terms of tools or things like that, but there are some fairly simple ones, like obviously Pirate Speak is a persona that speaks like a pirate and so on. So as I was mentioning, it really doesn't take much to make a persona. And in fact, the one we'll be looking at now is the Yoda persona. So Yoda from Star Wars, obviously. Um, so this is a very simple stylistic persona, and as you can see from the examples here, you can ask it obviously Star Wars related questions, but you can just as well ask it something like, "How can I improve my Wolfram language skills?" and it will respond to that as well. So this is what I was talking about when I mean like a general purpose persona. So it's not really instructed to discuss anything specific. It will happily answer questions about anything, um, but it will do so in the style of Yoda. So we'll look at the first thing we'll do is we'll look at that Yoda persona. We'll go kind of under the hood and we'll see the instructions that are used to make that persona. But just before we do that, let's talk about how do we actually import them. So if we're talking about personas from the repository, the easiest way to import them programmatically is using LLM prompt and then the name of the persona. So if I want to import the Yoda persona from the repository, this is all I need to do. And now I can use this kind of symbolic object anywhere in my code. I can also do so from the menu. So if I go to my chat notebook settings, there is this menu called Add and Manage Personas. And there are a few different options here: prompt repository, URL definition notebook. Prompt repository and URL, you can pass the URL obviously of the persona, and that adds it to your list of personas. Definition notebook. So if you are creating your own persona, that will live in a language. That will live in a Wolfram Mathematica notebook, sorry, and that will be stored on your computer. So when you're finished with creating your persona, you can just import it very easily through the definition notebook. We'll get to that later on, but for now we are still working with the uh, with the with the personas from the repository. Cool. Um, Switching between personas. So again, I'll just show you very quickly what that is like because it's fairly obvious. So we're not going to um, spend too much time on it. But if you're using the personas from chat input cells, you can click on this little icon here on the left, and that brings up the menu with all of the personas that you have available. Or you can do so from the top right again from our chat notebook settings. You can click plain chat, and now every new chat input cell that you open is going to default to the persona you've chosen. So fairly simple, basic stuff. Not spending too much time on it. Um, so I would like to spend a minute or two on LLM synthesize. So as I mentioned, um, you have programmatic access to everything that the chat input cells can do. But probably the function that you'll find yourself using the most is called LLM synthesize. So what LLM synthesize does is it takes either one argument or a list of arguments. Um, it puts everything into a string and it sends that string to the LLM backend that you are using. So to take even simpler example, I can call LLM synthesize with a simple string saying hello, and that is going to get sent when I evaluate that function. It's going to get sent to the backend model and it's going to respond. So in terms of using LLMs programmatically, LLM synthesize is your first point of contact with them, so to speak. As I mentioned, it can take a simple string, or it can take a list of strings. So in this case, we are using LLM prompt Yoda. As I mentioned, this is kind of the easiest programmatic way to import something from the prompt repository. So here we're using Yoda. And then as the second element in the list, we are saying I'm trying to use code. When we send this, all of this will be kind of concatenated into a single string, and it will be sent to the backend, and you'll see your response. Cool. So before I go into creating your own persona, I just want to see. I'm sure I had a section here about. Oh yeah, this is it. So as I said, it's before we get into creating our own persona, it's very useful to see how simple a persona can be. So here we're going to take our Yoda persona and we're going to get a specific property of it. And the property that we're going to get is its prompt text. In the case of the Yoda persona, the prompt text is basically everything that defines that persona. And if we evaluate that, we can see all of the instructions that went into creating that persona. And as you can see, they're just a very basic 3 or 4 sentence instructions. Your Yoda, respond to all inputs in the voice of Yoda from Star Wars, um, and so on, and a few other bits. But whoever created the Yoda persona, all they had to do is input those instructions. Obviously, give it a nice icon as well, so it looks like Yoda. But in terms of functional functional input, this is all they had to do, and then you have your persona. Obviously, this is the most basic example of a persona, but it's still useful to see how minimal and how easy it is to create one. So let's actually look at how we can create our own. So the easy again, as with a lot of things in Wolfram language, there are many different ways of doing it. I'm just going to show you the easiest one because we do have a template for personas specifically. So if you want to create your own, the easiest way to do it is to access that template, just fill it out with all of your kind of prompt engineering and indexing information, and then just import it as a persona, and that's it. So it's fairly simple. In terms of how to access the template, you can go to File, New. There's a menu called. I'm not sure if this is too small. Hopefully, it's not too small to see. But I'm going to the obviously the toolbar, going to New Resource Repository item, and then I'm selecting Prompt Resource. When I do that, I see this again. Let me make this a bit bigger so people can see. When I do that, I see this template, which I can start filling out immediately. But all it takes to create a persona is to fill out this template, save it as a notebook on your local machine, and like I mentioned from the chat notebook settings, you can import this notebook directly and you can start using your persona. So I will run through the most important sections because there are actually quite a lot of sections in this template, but most of them are just for indexing purposes, especially if you're planning to submit your persona to the prompt repository. There are a lot of things. You need to fill like your author name, like keywords, what topics your persona covers. But in terms of just getting a functional persona, a persona that does something, even if it's just a stylistic persona, you don't really need to fill all of those things if it's just for your own use. So I'll go through the sections that you do need to fill in to get a working persona. Um, okay, let's go back to the template and let's look at it. So the most basic things you need, obviously, the name of your persona, what is it going to call? And this is, again, this is just so you can recognize it in the menu, a description, and then the functional part of your persona lives here in the prompt text section. Um, Here is where you input all of your instructions, how the persona should behave, what it is made to do, how it should interact with the user, and so on. So if we go back to our Yoda persona, let me just go back to the instructions. So I will copy and paste that set of instructions, and I'll paste it in the template just to show you, if you were the one creating the Yoda persona, this is pretty much all you would need to do. You give it a name, a description, and you give it the instructions here. You can have your nice icon here, but it's not mandatory. And that's it. If you save this notebook now and you import it from your personas menu and you chat to it, it's going to behave exactly the same way as the Yoda persona from the prompt repository. So in terms of kind of the minimal input required to get a persona working, this is pretty much it. Just the name of a persona and the instructions. Um, Let me just look at the template, make sure I'm not forgetting something. Yeah, obviously you can give examples of how the persona is supposed to behave, indexing information about yourself, any additional notes. But yeah, in terms of the functional fields in this template, it really is mainly the prompt text. There is another important but optional field, which is the LLM configuration. And when we come to the LLM tools, into actually giving your persona kind of access to Wolfram language functions, essentially, this is where we'll input them. But if we're just doing a stylistic persona that doesn't use any code, we can just leave this blank. But we'll come back to it a bit later on. Um, so yeah, we kind of touched on the prompt engineering part, um, which is what goes into the prompt text section. But here's kind of a more detailed uh, summary of the types of things that you can include in that prompt text section. So the first and the most obvious one is obviously the purpose. So what is the purpose of the persona you're creating? It could be to suggest Wolfram language code that will accomplish the user task. It could be that the persona is a teacher that will challenge the student to consider a subject more deeply. It could be basically anything you want it to be, anything that you think an LLM would be good at. In terms of other types of things that you can instruct it, length instructions are fairly common, especially in stylistic personas. So you could say things like use up to 30 words if you want. If you don't want your persona to be very verbose, you can say return only one word, write at least 50 words, suggest three examples, and so on. So these are all things about the length of the responses. Style we already covered. Speak like Yoda from Star Wars. Speak like a teacher. Speak like whatever you want. And then topic control, safety, and defense are pretty much one category. And so, whereas the previous categories were about what you want your persona to do, uh, these last few ones are what do you want your persona not to do. So they could be things like don't engage in arguments with the user. So you can imagine if you're, say, you're developing a persona that is going to be used on the website of your business, like many businesses are doing nowadays. You don't really want that persona to be arguing with customers. You don't want it to be discussing politics or religion, probably. If it's a persona meant to help with Wolfram language, maybe you only want it to talk about that. And then some more kind of serious things like never discuss anything that might be harmful to the user, never suggest a recipe that includes toxic items, don't discuss illegal things. Um, you can and you probably should include those things in your persona, but I would say that um, those things are already baked in into whatever backend model you're using. So if you go to, again, I'll use ChatGPT because it's the uh, most kind of popular service, but it applies to all of them. If you go to ChatGPT and you ask, "Hey, how do I make a bomb?" It's going to refuse to answer that because these instructions are already built in. So, insofar as your persona uses, let's say, OpenAI as a backend model, those things will already be included, kind of for free, if you will. But if you need them to be something more specific, you can definitely include them in your prompt text. Cool. Hopefully that's fairly obvious. I don't want to spend too much time on these things because I think when we get to the LLM tools and things like that, that's where things get a bit more interesting. Um, so I'm kind of glossing over, but they're fairly obvious things. Um, so yeah, so we covered what things you might want to include in your instructions, and the next important point to make is that you're probably not going to get them right the first time, or you'll get them mostly right, but you'll see that there's room for improvement. So um, one of the things that you find yourself doing when you're developing personas is that you need to iterate. So you need to come up with a set of instructions and you need to test your persona. You need to test whether your persona behaves in the way you expect it to. You'll see that, yeah, mostly it does, but there are some edge cases where it can do better. So you go back to your prompts, um, you modify them, you deploy your persona, you try it again, and you kind of engage in that iterative process until you're happy with the end result. Now, while you're still at that stage, while you're still at the stage of kind of testing out your prompts, I don't recommend that you actually do that in the template because even though it's fairly simple, you save this notebook, you import it from the menu. It's still extra effort, and if you are going back and forth 5 or 10 times, changing your instructions, it can get a bit cumbersome. That's why we have LLM synthesize. So LLM synthesize is especially useful if you want to kind of experiment with different things. So you only need to change the text here. You don't need to save anything. You don't need to import anything. So here is kind of a mini example where we are developing, I believe, a physics tutor. And these are the basic set of instructions that we're giving our physics tutor. We're to kind of summarize this. We're basically telling it, help people with physics, don't help them with anything that is dangerous or immoral, illegal, and so on. So let's say that this is what we start out with. And then we want to ask a few different questions to our persona. So here we have a list of 3 things. Let me just make them a bit more obvious. So, so we have the first question we want to ask: what is the period of a pendulum? A fairly standard physics question, I suppose. Um, then we have a question: how should I vote in the next election? And how do I make a bomb? So we are hoping that by asking our persona different things, we can see how it responds to them. And ideally, we want our physics tutor to answer the first question, to refuse to answer the second question, and to definitely refuse to answer the third one. So we can test that immediately without needing to deploy anything. So here we are again. We are using LLM synthesize. We are inserting each one of our questions, and we're inserting them here, and we are asking each one of our questions. And we're framing each response just so we can have a kind of a visual separation of all of them. So the first response, the period of a pendulum, it gave us the answer. I'm no physicist. I don't know if this is correct, but I'll assume that it is. The second question, which was how should I vote in the next election, it um, it gave us kind of the response that we want, which is I'm only able to discuss physics matters. And the third one, how do I make a bomb? Actually, that we didn't even get a chance to get a response from that, because as I mentioned, so I'm using OpenAI's models here, and it fails. That question fails to generate a response because of what I was mentioning, because there are already safety instructions baked into those models by default. So it didn't even have to. It didn't even have to consider our prompts. Just the model itself, the backend just refused to answer. So technically, we don't really need this prompting because something very similar to it already exists, but it's good for illustration purposes. So, and this is basically what we need to do. If we're developing a physics tutor, let's say we were not happy with the second answer, we can go back to our prompts. We can have some additional instructions here, and then all we need to do is come back, rerun this, and see whether the response is different. So LLM synthesize really allows you to be very kind of to very quickly iterate um, with your prompts. And when you're finally happy with how your persona is behaving, you just take this, copy and paste it, go back to your template notebook, paste it here, and then you're ready to go. Cool. Um, Dynamic prompts. Okay, so far all we have been doing is we have been instructing our models with plain text. So just basic English language or any natural language. So let's look at how we can actually start injecting code into our instructions. So here we have, again, a fairly simple kind of example. We are giving some instructions to an LLM. Your historical persona, always answer as if you were somebody from basically 100 years ago. So if we want to have that instruction, we can input the text 1925 would be 100 years ago. Now, the problem with that is 100 years ago is a different thing today um, compared to what it will be obviously next year. So if we were deploying that persona, um, when next year rolls around, we would have to come back and change our prompt to be 1926. We can be more intelligent than that, and we can use Wolfram language code. So here we're taking this piece of code, although it could be any piece of code that returns a string. So this piece of Wolfram language code takes the current year and it subtracts 100 from it. So we can use that code directly into our instructions, and we can mix it with our plain text instructions. And now that we have this prompt, we're using LLM prompt generator, which is a function to generate prompts. If you're interested in it, the documentation for it is excellent. But basically, what happens is once we define this prompt, um, the LLM is not going to receive this piece of code. So um, when we evaluate a chat input cell or when we use LLM synthesize, this code gets evaluated before any text is sent to the LLM, and the result of this code is what actually gets sent. So even though this is what it looks like in our prompt, what the LLM is going to receive is 1925. If we run it now, if we run it next year, it's going to receive 1926 and so on. So fairly basic idea. Let's just give it a quick test, make sure that it works. And you can see we're again using LLM synthesize for our basic communication with the LLM. The thing we're doing differently here is we are specifying things for the LLM evaluator. And this is where a lot you can go very granular into what the LLM receives. Here we're still doing a fairly simple thing. We're saying that we have custom prompts, and the custom prompts live in this old timer variable. And the old timer variable is just our prompt. So we can ask something basic like, what did you do today? And because our prompt also gets sent, which contains all of our instructions, then our LLM will happily pretend to be somebody from 100 years in the past. So it's talking about the Phantom of the Opera and hopefully things that are relevant for 1925. Cool. I'm skipping over some things because I'm kind of eager to get into computational tools. So going back, actually, just taking a little bit of extra time to explain what's happening here. We can very well have very complicated piece of Wolfram language code right in our prompt. The disadvantage of that, kind of the drawback of that, is that this piece of code gets evaluated every single time you communicate to the LLM. So every time I call LLM synthesize with this prompt, this piece of code will get evaluated. Now, in this case, it's a fairly simple piece of code, so that's not a huge problem. But when we have kind of more substantial functionality, we want to delegate the responsibility of evaluating the code to the LLM itself. So we want to say, you have access to this piece of Wolfram language functionality. If you think it's useful to answer the query of the user, use it, evaluate the code, get the result, um, inform your kind of response based on it. But if it's not relevant, then don't use it. So in this case, maybe me asking, what did you do today? Maybe it is relevant um, that the year is 1925. But if I'm asking, for example, oh, help me fix this Wolfram language code, then that's not relevant. But if I use LLM synthesize, this will get evaluated anyway. So the way we kind of delegate that responsibility to the LLM, and really the way we get kind of the most value of our custom personas workflows, is by defining a computational tool. So what is a computational tool? A computational tool is basically any piece of Wolfram language functionality that is made available to the LLM. So anything you can do in Wolfram language, you can also wrap into this LLM tool function. And when you call your LLM, you can pass this LLM tool to them, and then it is up to them to decide. Excuse me. It is up to them to decide whether this should be used or not based on the user query. So let's look at the simple tool that we have here. So we have LLM tool. The syntax, so if you have used, I believe it's API function, if you have used um, this function, API function, then you already be familiar with the syntax of LLM tool because it's the same. But if you haven't, I'll just take a minute to explain what is happening here. So we have LLM tool, and the first argument we have, let me just split this into a few lines just to be a bit more clear. So the first argument of LLM2 is the name of the tool. This is mainly just for kind of your own indexing purposes, but I would suggest that the name should be something that is descriptive, because LLMs will look at that name and it will form the basis on their decision whether to use the tool or not. So giving it something descriptive like country population finder is absolutely fine. The second argument of LLM2 is the arguments, and in this case, we have one argument. Um, we have the country, which is going to be of type country, and then the last argument is just the function, the actual piece of Wolfram language code that will be evaluated. So we have, in this case, we have country, which the LLM will insert something in this argument. And then we have our standard Wolfram language code to get the population of that country for 100 years in the past. Cool. So let's define that and let's test it out. Again, using LLM synthesize, having our standard kind of prompting here. Um, and we can ask something additional like, how is life, use the tool you have. Again, using LLM evaluator, this time we're saying that we'll be providing a computational tool, and we're pointing to the variable that contains the tool. So let's run that, and you'll see in this indicator here, if the LLM is using the tool, you get a nice kind of indicator message calling tool country population finder. Now, because in this case, I specifically instructed the LLM to use the tool, it used the tool, which gave it the population of the United States. Now, I didn't say the United States, but it had to pick some country, so it picked that. And obviously, the result of the tool gave it the population of the United States in the year 1925. And once the LLM sees that output of the Wolfram language function, it can use it in its response. Um, if I call, so the important thing here is that the LLM is not going to use this tool every time. If I'm not that explicit and I ask it a general question like "How is life?", maybe it's not going to use it because the population of the country in 1925 is not that relevant to answer the question "How is life?". And you can see that if I'm not explicit, it doesn't use the tool. It just gives the basic LLM answer. Um, but that's all it takes. So it's LLM tools have a bit more complicated syntax, but it really pays off just wrapping your functionality in an LLM tool and providing it as part of LLM Evaluator. And you can have as many tools as you like. So in this case, I have population tool, but if I have some other tools, some other tool, I can just wrap them in a list and I'll give it to the LLM. It has access to all of them. Depending on my question, it will choose to run some of them or not run others and so on. That's the most basic way you can use tools. Let me see if there is anything else that we need to talk about in this notebook before we move into the actual personas. Um, as I mentioned in LLM Evaluator, you can go really granular in terms of the parameters and the options that you can pass to the backend. Here, some of the most basic ones are kind of covered. Temperature, as I mentioned, like um, determines how creative the backend is. So if you have a high value of temperature, and the value itself kind of depends on the backend. So OpenAI models will have different values compared to Anthropic models, but the basic idea is that if you have a higher value for temperature, then the LLM is going to be a bit more creative with its answers. If you have a lower value, it will try to be more deterministic. So how does that relate to our personas? Why do we care about that? Basically, if you're developing a persona that has to be deterministic, like something like if you're developing a persona, let's say, to help people with their code, you don't want it to be very creative. You don't want it to spin different stories and things like that. So you would have the temperature value of you would have a low temperature value essentially. If you're developing, on the other hand, a persona that is meant to, I don't know, write poetry, then you do want it to be creative. You do want it to kind of be a bit more free in that sense. So you would have a higher value. So it's just a parameter you have an access to further tweak the responses of your persona. It doesn't make that much of a difference unless you go to the extreme values. Um, but it's something that is at your control that you can very easily kind of specify. The other option that we have here is max tokens, and max tokens basically it defines a hard limit um, to how to the output of your persona. So if you have something very low, you can enforce your persona to respond in a very brief way. Um, so here, if I have max tokens 5, then I get a very short sentence compared to if I have 25, I'll get something more kind of more verbose. So again, not super important, but again, um, another parameter that is under your control. Cool. Um, Other sections of the personas. Oh, I should have mentioned. Let me just go back to the LLM tools. I forgot to mention something. So when we define LLM tools, we use this LLM tool functionality. As I mentioned, the syntax is name of the function, parameters, and the actual function. If we if we want to test it programmatically in our notebook, then we can just do that. Do what I've done: LLM synthesize, pass the tools to LLM evaluator. Once you're happy with your tools, you can just copy this LLM tool definition and you can go to your template notebook. And there is a section for LLM tools, and basically you just copy and paste it here, evaluate it, and then now your persona will have access to the tool. Um, so just to mention the relevant section where this goes in the template. Cool. Let's get back to our content. Um, Other sections. So in terms of the sections of the template that you will be filling out, as I mentioned, the basic instruction sections, prompt text. This is where your plain text lives, and LLM tools is where you'll be defining the actual computational tools um, that your persona will have access to, and that's pretty much it in terms of again in terms of functional um, in terms of things that determine how functional your persona is. That is pretty much it. LLM tools, prompt text. There are other sections, obviously. Um, Many of them are optional, and I would say that unless you are planning to submit to the prompt repository, which I encourage you to do actually, if you have some cool ideas, if you develop some cool personas, feel free to submit them so other people can use them as well. But if you're just developing a persona for your own use, then you don't need to worry about most of the sections. Cool. So let's say you have developed your persona, you have filled out the prompt text with your general instructions, you have populated the LLM tool sections with your LLM tools. How do you actually start using um, your persona? Um, there are several ways to do that. The most simple one, as I mentioned, is saving this notebook to your local machine, then going to the chat notebook settings. So, as I mentioned, the menu add and manage personas. Click on definition notebook and locate the notebook wherever you have saved it. Um, when you find it, just import it, and your persona will get added. Um, will get added to your list. You can start using it immediately. So that's again, if you're only developing a persona for yourself, that is the easiest way to get started. You could, of course, share your persona with other people. So in the template notebook, there is this section called deploy. And if you click it, you'll see a few different options. Again, this is probably too small for people to see on the screen, but I'll just go through the kind of the basic options. Um, Really, the ones you care about. If you want to use it on your cloud account, so you can either use it on Wolfram Cloud itself, or you can get a link that only works for your Wolfram account. So this is, for example, if I'm developing a persona on this machine, but I also want to use it on my personal laptop, I will deploy it for my cloud account. I'll get the link. So when you deploy for your, well, let's test it out actually. Um, so I'm getting some warnings here because I've not set a description and things like that, but there's nothing too serious. So this should deploy. Um, so once it does deploy, you will get a direct link to your persona. Now, because we're only deploying to our own cloud account, the link will only be accessible to us and not to other people. If we want to generate a link that we can share with other people, we can choose publicly in the cloud. But in either case, you will get something like this. So once your persona has finished deploying, you get a link, it opens in your browser, and you have everything. You have, well, this is not really a real persona. I was just showing things, but if it was a real persona, all I would need to do is copy this link, go back to my notebook, to my standard notebook, go back to my personas menu, select URL, and then enter the URL here, press OK, and my persona will work. So yeah, either save the note if you're only planning to use it on one machine, just save the template notebook, import it directly. If you're planning to switch between machines, just deploy it for your cloud account, share the link with yourself. If you want to share it with other people publicly in the cloud. Pretty straightforward. And all of this is described in much more detail in the notebook, by the way. So if you are, because I'm aware that I'm kind of glossing over a few things, but if you're interested in kind of more detailed instructions, you can find those in the notebook itself. There are also some strangely undocumented functions. that you can, because I've been showing you how to add your persona from the menu. But what if you have a link and you want to add it programmatically for some reason? There's this undocumented function that takes a link to a persona and just adds it to your menu. Again, hopefully this will be documented soon. Um, but in the meantime, if you do need to do that programmatically, this is the function you can use. Cool. Just seeing if there's anything else. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to do before I get into the actual personas that I've developed previously is to show you how you can create essentially an API where you can design a persona, you can deploy it on the web, and you can allow other people to kind of chat with it. So the basic idea is that you're defining an API function, and API function is a built-in function in Wolfram language. It works not just for LLM personas; it works for all sorts of different things. But it declares a RESTful API endpoint. If you haven't had experience with APIs, probably don't know exactly what that means, but you don't need to worry about it. The basic idea is that you are declaring a web address where people can access that web address and they can submit different things to it. So in the case of our LLM persona, those things would be their actual queries or the actual questions that they want to ask the persona or chat with the persona. So let's look at what that looks like. We're using API function, um, and we are saying that there will be one argument that this function will take, which is the user input, which will be a string. And the actual function is LLM synthesize, our standard function to communicate with the LLM. Our persona, in this case, we're using Yoda just for simplicity. But if you have designed your own persona, you can import it here. And then the actual user input. That's pretty much all you need to do to define an API function. It's very simple, one line of code. Say that you accept an argument and insert that argument in whichever part of your Wolfram language code you would like to insert it in. Once we are done with that, we can use Cloud Deploy to actually make it available on the web. And again, very simple to do. We're just saying to Cloud Deploy what we want to deploy, which is our API. We're giving it a name and we are giving it permissions. So in this case, and especially during development, it's wise to have private permissions. Private just means that you're the only user that can access that API. Obviously, once you are done with development, and if you wish other people to be able to access that, you would change private to public, and then your URL will be accessible to anyone. But let's stick with private for now, just to see how that works. And once we deploy, we get a URL, and then we can kind of interface with that URL in different ways. We can do it directly through our browser, and we can also do it programmatically from our Wolfram language notebook. And this is how to do that. We're using the URL execute function, which basically sends something to a URL. In this case, that something will be user input hello. And we're sending that user input, obviously, to our API that we just deployed. And if we give it a few seconds, we will see the response. So this is the response from our Yoda persona, which is what we deployed. Fairly simple. And once you have the RESTful API endpoint, you can use it from any environment, any programming language. You could make your own website, for example, in let's say HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and you can use that endpoint in your website. You don't even need to care that it's written in Wolfram language, because Wolfram language will serve essentially as the backend, as the thing that you can communicate with and get responses from. Cool. Finally, other than your basic kind of LLM synthesize arguments that you can pass, you can also manipulate chat objects. And these are things, so if you want to keep history of the chat, you would do it with chat objects. And you have slightly different functionality for that. You need to define a chat object, and you need to say what goes into the chat object. So that will be the persona, it will be the evaluator. But the idea here is that you can start building um, you can start building a history. So instead of so because this API that we just defined here, um, every time a user sends something, it essentially starts a different conversation. It has no concept of chat history or anything like that. If you do want to build something a bit more kind of traditional chatbot like, where people can have conversations that span many messages, you will do that via chat objects. I'm not going into too much detail into that because the syntax is slightly different, and um, it will take a long time to get into it. But if you are interested in building that kind of programmatic pipeline, all of the functionality you need is here, and it's basically just chat objects and chat evaluate instead of LLM synthesize. Yes, skipping over some things. The idea is that when you use chat objects and chat evaluate, you get all of the information, including the history, including whether the user sent the message or the LLM sent the message. And once you have all of that information, you can kind of write your own uh, logic to manipulate that in whatever way you choose. Cool. Let me see. Is there anything else I want to cover here? Oh, let me see if this works. Yeah. So we have been using LLM synthesize um, quite a bit in this webinar, and kind of the disadvantage of LLM synthesize is that it's a synchronous function, meaning that you send something to the backend and then you wait for the response to be finished, and that's when you receive it. We can also do that asynchronously with LLM synthesize submit. And what asynchronously means basically is that we define a function, we send our query to the backend, but we don't block everything else while waiting for the response. So the backend can do its writing, and once it's done, it notifies our asynchronous function, and that's when we get the response. So if you're doing queries that either take a long time to generate, and that's actually especially useful if you're using local models. So I found that myself when I'm using some local models that my machine is really struggling with. They tend to be very slow. So I can use LLM synthesize submit to kind of delegate that to the LLM model instead of waiting, let's say, 2 minutes for a response. And you can use that in conjunction with some other functionality to get like a live streaming, which in this case doesn't, because it's so fast on the back end. It looks like it's instantaneous. But if this was a slower model, you would see the text appearing token by token as you do on things like ChatGPT. Again, nothing too important or exciting, just something to be aware of if you do need that functionality. Parallel table, kind of a similar idea. In this case, you are able to send a lot of things in parallel using different cores on your CPU. Um, so here we have essentially, how much is it? Let's say 10 different prompts, and we can send them in parallel and then just receive them in one list at the end. Cool. There are some more things here in this notebook, but I'll come back to them because I really want to show you the personas first, because they are the main point of this webinar. If we have time, I'll come back to LLM functions and things like that. So um, from the notebook materials, you will have access to this. Let me make this a bit bigger. You will have access to this personas folder, which will contain several examples. In this case, it's just 3. Um, but they are different personas that kind of basically they combine together everything that we have been discussing in the webinar so far. So there are text instructions, there are LLM tools, and there's indexing information in the templates and so on. So for each of those personas, I will show you the template notebook that is used to generate it, and I will also test it live. So obviously with LLM, sometimes things break, but that's part of the fun. So we'll do some live testing on these personas. So we'll start with the most simple one, which is called Wolfener. Not a very creative name, and you'll see why. Um, so this is the template notebook that is used to generate that persona. So we have the name, we have the description. Um, the first important section, as we mentioned, the prompt text. You can see that it's fairly simple in this case. Your custom persona that helps users shorten URLs. You have access to a tool which takes one parameter and returns a shortened version of it. You know what to do. So, especially with personas, that do something fairly simple, you don't need to go into that much detail in your instructions. LLMs are very capable of kind of figuring out um, what to do based on messy inputs. So this is a fairly simple set of instructions. Have our little icon here, which is a wolf holding an axe. Presumably that's how it's going to shorten the URLs for us. And the other important section that we have is obviously the LLM tool. Now, in this case, the LLM tool is really as simple as it can be, but let's go through it anyway. So we have our LLM tool function. We have the name of the tool, URL shorten. We have a description of the tool, which is shortens a URL. We have the arguments that it's going to take, in this case, a URL, and we have the actual functionality. So if you're not familiar with this function, let me just open a new notebook just to show you what we are using. Uh, if you're not familiar with this function in Wolfram language, it's called URL shorten. It takes any website, so it could be google.com, and it gives you a short. Well, in this case, Google is very short already, but if this was some long URL, you would get something like this back, which is much more useful for sharing and so on. So this is what essentially we want to make this function available to our LLM persona. Um, in terms of how we do that, that's really all it takes. Again, the syntax is slightly different, but once you get used to it, it's fairly simple. This is the highlighted is essentially the main functional part of that syntax. But just with that, we are able to use that persona. So let's test it out. Let me see if I have imported this one. I think I have not. So that's actually a good chance to show you how you can import your local personas. So we are going, let me close this. We're going to the menu on the top right, add and manage personas. And we're saying that we want to supply one from a definition notebook. Then we locate it on our machine. In this case, it's here. We click open, and it takes a little while, especially if your persona has a big icon. It takes a little while to import that image for some reason, but just give it a few seconds and it will be available. While I was doing that, let me just look at the questions. Oh, getting some errors. Apparently, the notebook download contains just the SQL Zebra persona. Is that true? So you only have access to one of the personas. Is that right? Apologies for that. I will make sure uh, to distribute the right materials after the webinar. Apologies for all the issues with the links. I was fixing a few things just before the webinar, and I probably messed something up. But I will make sure that everyone who's attending on Big Marker, we already have your email, so we'll just send the right materials to you. Apologies for all of this. Um, but actually, SQL Zebra is the kind of the most interesting one, so it's good that at least you have that. Okay, so our persona should be imported by now, so let's test it out. And as you can see, once it's imported, it is available in our drop-down menu. If we can click on the icon here, we can select it, and we can give it our question. So in this case, it will be, can you shorten this URL for me? Okay. And once we do that, it will. So you see, when you use chat input cells, you get this really nice visual indicator that your LLM persona has used a tool. And the good thing is you can inspect exactly what the persona has done. Um, so in this case, we have a tool that takes one argument, so we can see exactly how the LLM persona filled that argument. In this case, it has done it correctly. It has just passed the URL for that argument, and you can see the output that the function generated. So essentially, the LLM ran the function with this argument, it received this output, and based on that, it gave us the response. So let's click on that link just to see if it takes us to Google, which it does. So that's functional. Um, Obviously, a very simple persona. There's not that much to say about this one. Just a very simple, almost like a proof of concept of how you can have a simple tool and use it. There is something to say about the backend models, um, especially because we have a choice between so many different things at the moment. So if you're using, let's say, OpenAI, you have a list of 20 different models. Some of them are very big and very expensive. Some of them are very small and very cheap. One thing to keep in mind, one kind of almost like a piece of advice, is if your persona is very simple, like our URL shortening persona is, you can be pretty sure that you can select a very small model, a very cheap model, and it is going to behave correctly. So in this case, if we were using this persona, we can say always use the cheapest model that OpenAI have available, and in this way we can save money. If our persona is doing something more complicated, like our SQL Zebra persona will be doing, for example, that's when you might consider um, choosing a more expensive model, a bigger model, more capable, more intelligent model. So, just a piece of advice on selecting models in relation to what your persona is actually doing. Cool. Let's look at the other ones. PAM, let me close this. Again, I'll show you the definition notebook and then we'll test it out in real time just to see if it behaves correctly. So PAM is your portfolio assistant manager. What PAM does is it uses the built-in financial functionality of Wolfram language to do some interesting things. So let's look at the definition notebook to see what it actually does. So again, starting with our basic instructions, you're a portfolio manager assistant. Essentially, I'm not going to read out the whole thing. Basically, the idea is you are the user's portfolio manager. Help them answer their question about their portfolio. The interesting part is obviously the LLM tools. And as you can see here, it gets substantially more complicated now compared to our URL shortener persona. Not going to go through every line of the code, but I will tell you just in plain English what each LLM tool does. So here, well, the first thing to say is we have how many? One, two, three. We have three different LLM tools. As I mentioned, your persona can have as many tools as you wanted to have. The only thing you need to do is wrap them in a list, separate them by a comma, and you're good to go. So let's go through the different tools that this persona has. So this is the first one, the highlighted one. And we can see from looking at the name, get portfolio value. So this is going to import the user's portfolio, and it will use again the built-in financial functionality of Wolfram language to determine the value of that portfolio. Um, yeah, in this case, we are going to be using financial derivative, which is kind of a very extensive piece of functionality in Wolfram language, and we'll apply it to whatever options the user holds in their portfolio. Second LLM tool, compute portfolio Greeks. Um, if you're not familiar um, with finance, I mean, I'm no financial expert either, but from my understanding, the Greeks, when it comes to financial portfolios and financial instruments, are parameters that or indicators that tell you how your portfolio is positioned given some market conditions. So what this LLM2 is going to do is it's going to assume some basic market conditions like interest rate being 0.05, dividend being 0.01, and it will compute those Greeks, those parameters that tell us how our portfolio is positioned in the market. Again, using the built-in functionality in Wolfram language. Finally, we have LLM tool, and sorry, we have generate random portfolio LLM tool, and what that does is it's going to pick uh, a random set of a kind of predefined tickers. So there will be things like Apple, Tesla, Nvidia, and so on. So the LLM can use that if the user doesn't have a portfolio, like I don't at the moment. And if you're trying out this persona, um, after I send you the right materials after the webinar, you wouldn't have a portfolio yet. So you can just ask your persona to generate one so you can explore the other tools as well, which is what we're going to do. But this just takes a random number of any of these stickers and it generates a portfolio and it saves it so it can be used by the other tools. Cool. Let's test it out. Let's see how it works in practice. So this one I believe I already have installed because I was testing it before the webinar. Let me make this a bit bigger as well. So the first thing I want to do is say generate a random portfolio for me. So you'll notice I don't really need to say use this or that tool because just based of my question, the LLM can kind of figure out what to do, figure out which tool is appropriate to use. And as we can see here, it has used the correct tool, generate random portfolio, and it has saved it in my documents folder. And then I can ask things like, okay, get me the value of my portfolio. So hopefully, when I ask it a question like that, well, it's not a question, it's a statement. But when I say that, it's going to use the second tool, which is to get the value of the portfolio using the built-in functionality, which it has done here, and it has given me a breakdown of what is the total value, and then broken down by the different options. So the total value of my portfolio is $42,000. So I'm doing quite well. I have some Visa options. I have some Amazon, Visa again, Amazon again, and Meta. So all of this again, we can inspect the tool core just to see what the LLM has done and what it has received. So the actual output of the Wolfram language functionality looks like this. So the LLM, sorry, this doesn't look good when I highlight it. When the LLM sees this, it is able to pull out the numbers very reliably um, from the tool output and then weave them into a kind of a more understandable narrative. So we can just have a very quick look just to confirm that it has not hallucinated any numbers. 42059 is correct. I was rounded this up, but that's fine. The Visa ones are position value 3081.95. That's correct. So you can see that yeah, LLMs are even small models are fairly good at taking a structured input like that and then explaining or weaving it into their response to you. So there's one more tool that our persona does, and it actually kind of preempts our next question. It says, "I can compute the Greeks for you. Let me know." And again, this is actually a good example to show why LLM tools are very useful, especially if you have several. Um, you don't want your persona to run every single tool on every single query. You want it to run them as appropriate. So you can say, yes, compute the Greeks for me. And then that will hopefully be successful as well. Again, if you have tools where your persona is kind of struggling to use them or it's generating incoherent responses, the first thing to do is to try that with a larger model. That's usually the biggest kind of bottleneck to effective usage. But in this case, even though the functionality itself is not completely trivial, in terms of what the LLM needs to do, it just needs to provide one argument or two arguments to the function, and it needs to interpret the output. So it's pretty reliable. I would say, and we can see that it has used the correct tool, and it has given us again a breakdown. So you can see again, this is a good example. So the output is just the different parameters and their values. But because LLMs have a lot of built-in knowledge, so this is not about our persona. Obviously, the LLM backends have a lot of knowledge built into them. It sees these values and it can explain what they actually mean. So it's very useful. In this specific case, it's very useful, especially for someone like me who doesn't really know anything about finance. So it can give you an explanation like this indicates that the portfolio is positioned bearishly. Now I don't know what bearishly means, so I can ask, what does bearishly mean? And you can continue chatting. And if you ask it a normal question, it's not going to use any tools. You'll just get your standard LLM answers. Cool. This example was a success as well. And again, I'll make sure that you have access to this if you want to test it out, if you want to build upon it. And I have 5 minutes to show you SQL Zebra, which is the one that you do have access to. Let me just close some notebooks here so I can leave this open. I can close this. Cool. Moving on to SQL Zebra. So this, as I kind of alluded to earlier, this is probably the most complicated of the personas that we'll be looking at today. So what this well actually let's just go through the different sections. It's probably the best way to see what it does. So in the instructions to our SQL Zebra persona, again we have very basic instructions. You have access to an SQLite database. You have access to a tool. Again, just basic. This is what you're capable of doing. Please help the user with their queries. Um, just a kind of an aside, if you're not familiar with what SQL or SQLite means, they are types of relational databases that are very common pretty much everywhere, especially in large organizations. You can bet things like CRM systems are built on top of SQL databases. So they are just, you can think about them as file formats in the case of SQLite, or just technology stacks that allow organizations to store data in a very reliable, organized, structured, normalized way. So they are incredibly powerful, especially if you have tons of data, gigabytes, even terabytes of data, as many large organizations do. They allow you to store it in a way that ensures safety, redundancy. They have all sorts of benefits. The only drawback of them is that to kind of get information out of them, you need to write SQL, which is basically its own kind of programming language. There are some tools where you can kind of explore them visually and with more kind of a graphical user interface, but um, none of them are very intuitive or easy to work with. So when we're thinking about this persona, if we want to imagine kind of a use case for it, we can say that, let's say I have a small organization and I store all of my business data in an SQLite database. Now I know the SQL language, so I can get whatever data I want from it. But let's say that I have some colleagues that I want them to be able to access that as well, but I don't necessarily want them to spend 1 month learning all the different SQL commands. So what I'm going to do instead is, because I can run SQL commands from Wolfram language, I will give the functionality necessary for that to an AI persona, and then my colleagues or whoever can just take that persona and they can ask questions in normal, natural human language, and then the persona will write the SQL code for them. It will get the data and it will answer their questions. So that's an example use case. So that's what we're going to do. Instructions, very general. Tools is where things are obviously interesting. In this case, we have let me see, two tools. The first one is get database structure. This is a fairly simple tool, despite uh, so you can see this is actually the piece of SQL code here. But what this allows our LLM to do is to have an idea of what is in the database. What are the different tables? What are they called? What are the columns, and so on. And then the other tool is more general query SQL. This tool gives you the ability to execute SQLite commands. So this is the actual um, tool that the LLM will use to interface with the database. Cool. So what is the database? Before I go into an example of the persona itself, let me just show you. So this is a database example that I found on GitHub actually, and the source is in the source file, so you can find it there. And this is meant to represent kind of the business logic of a car dealership company. The data in the database itself is fake data, so there's no real customers and there's no personal data. But the structure of the database is meant to represent something that might be used in real life. So you can see there are 10 tables, let's say, and there's all sorts of complicated relationships between them. And the reason why I wanted to use an example like that instead of just a simple one table database is obviously with a one table database, everything is very simple. But if you have um, something more complicated, this is where LLMs kind of struggle. So let's see how our SQL Zebra does. I can look at this example. So the idea is that we can um, ask our persona any question where it can go into the database and give the answer to us. So in this case, we can ask what is the phone number of Jeremy Jacobs, and you can see I've done this before. So hopefully this should work again. So the first thing our LLM persona does is it gets the database structure, and which gives it all the different table names and columns and so on. Once it has that knowledge, it knows what SQL code to run because it knows the names of the tables, and it gets the output from the database. So you can see if we knew SQL ourselves, this is all we would need to run to get the result. But if we give this if we give this capability to an AI persona, then we can just ask it in plain, simple English, and we get the real information out of the database. So that's been it, and I'm right on time, which is good. Um, Hopefully, this was useful to you. I couldn't cover every single thing in the notebook, but you're very welcome to kind of explore that at your own leisure. Um, do you have any questions? I see there. Yeah, I will make sure that all of the materials are sent. Apologies for the broken links and the empty folders and things like that. I'll try to get the real material sent to everyone um, today, hopefully. So apologies for that. But do you have any questions on the webinar itself, on any of the functionality that we covered, or just any questions you might have about AI personas in general? I will. I'll hang around for a minute or so just to see if anyone has any questions. So Saad is asking, how can I get the certificate of this training? So after I end the webinar, there will be a survey which just asks you just general about your experience with the webinar, and I believe one of the questions is whether you want the certificate or not, and then you just click yes. So just hang around until we end the webinar here on Big Marker, and you'll have the option to do that. Okay. I don't see any more questions. So thank you very much for attending. I'll end the webinar now. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and feel free. Our next webinar is next Monday, and it will be me presenting again. And I'll be talking about combining Wolfram language and R. So we'll be looking at how we combine two programming languages into kind of unified workflows. If that sounds interesting to you, feel free to register for that, and I'll look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much for attending today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.